all heard of photosynthesis. If you took grade 10 biology, you know what photosynthesis is. But personally, I think it is an incredibly miraculous ability for plants to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, combine it with water, and use the original solar power to turn it into oxygen and glucose. Now, of course, we all depend on plants for this oxygen, right? We're hopefully appreciative that they perform this ecosystem service on our behalf. But there's something else really important here happening, and it was something that really eluded scientists for a long time, and that is the production of this glucose. So glucose, it's a fancy word for sugar. Another word, same word, would be carbohydrate. I'll bring your attention to the word carbohydrate. It has the word carbon in it because it's primarily made of carbon. And so glucose or carbohydrate is produced through this process of photosynthesis. But what scientists couldn't understand for the longest time was why plants were taking almost about half of the glucose that they were producing, and they were sending it down to the root zones and releasing it into the soil. It just didn't make any sense. Half of the glucose was going to make, a bigger stalk or more leaves or set new flowers, but almost half of it was getting sent down into the soil for what appeared to be really no reason at all. Well, of course, we know much better now that nothing in Mother Nature is for no reason at all. It's simply because our tiny little Homo sapien brains haven't quite wrapped our heads around it yet. But what the scientists finally figured out was that this glucose, this sugar that was being released into the soil, was in fact to feed the microbes, the microbial life that is in soil. So root exudate is a very fancy word for these carbohydrates, for these sugars that are getting released out into the soil. So this is when I want to ask you guys to think about the microbes in the soil. I want you to think of them as the Uber Eats delivery person of the soil. This is how it works. The plant will excrete the root exudates, and they will excrete specific ones based on what it is they need at that particular stage in the growth cycle. So the microbes that live around the root system, they'll get a little taste of this sugar, and they will know what it is the plant is asking for. And so what they do is they go out into the soil much farther than the root system could ever reach by itself. And they find those nutrients. Maybe they manufacture them. Maybe they pull them out of the rock like we discussed earlier. They bring those nutrients back to the plant and they deliver it to the root zone in exchange for more of that sugar. Microbes eat sugar. That's what they need. That's what they're looking for. So it turns out that plants and microbes have a synergistic relationship. That means that they both depend on each other to be their best selves, to be the healthiest, most thriving ecosystem that they can be. And, it actually turns out that it's a positive feedback loop. So the plant asks for certain nutrients, the microbes deliver, and then the plant is able to grow stronger and bigger and healthier. In exchange, it's able to do more photosynthesis, which creates more sugar, which extends back down to the root zones, releases into the soil, and the microbes then react accordingly. So it becomes a positive feedback loop where both the plants and the microbes are growing stronger and healthier. But it turns out that's actually not the only thing that the microbes are doing. Microbes have a huge host of roles to play in the soil, some of which we've discovered, many of which we have not yet figured out. So one of these, you probably have already heard of this idea that microbes help fix nitrogen. They work with legumes in the soil. They can turn nitrate into, or they can turn nitrogen into nitrate so that it's accessible. But some of the other cool things that they're able to do is, for example, they produce antibiotics to help protect the plant. And this really shouldn't be a surprise at all, because as humans, we've also learned how to use microbes to produce antibiotics to keep us healthy as well. Of course, plants have been doing that for a lot longer than we have. But what's interesting here is there's just so many roles that the microbes play in the soil that we need to ensure that there is that diversity, that there's a thriving population if we're going to be able to maximize the impact and really let the microbes do the hard work of growing healthy, nutrient-dense food. Another thing that microbes are able to do is influence the chemical and physical aspects of soil. So I'm going to give you two examples of how this works. The first is around the structure of soil. So if you think back to that bacteria I was talking about that's releasing enzymes, well, enzymes turn out to be sticky. They're kind of like a glue. And so what happens with that bacteria is it's, releasing this glue, and all of a sudden it's got a little bit of organic matter. Let's say a old piece of leaf, dying, dead leaf that's stuck to it all of a sudden. And then there's another little sand particle that sticks to it. So all of a sudden you have these little clumps of organic matter primarily, and this is called a microaggregate. And it sort of clumps around the bacterial glues. What happens then is that fungi, so fungi are a bit different than bacteria. They still have this primary decomposer role where they help to break down things in the soil that are really hard to break down. So think about things like trees, or the stalk of a grain. And anything that takes a long time to decompose, chances are it's fungi that are the only ones that are able to do that decomposition. But regardless of what they're decomposing, fungi have long, thin strands, kind of like spaghetti that they create. And so what happens with these microaggregates, you got your bacteria, your clump, you've got your little clump of microaggregate, and then the fungi comes along, and what it does with its long spindly fibers is it wraps around a few microaggregates. So all of a sudden you have a macroaggregate. And these macroaggregates are what really gives soil its structure. And here's the analogy to explain that. If you think of filling a vase with sand, so very, very tiny little particles, let's say just something very small like sand, you're going to be able to put a lot of sand into that vase. But then when you try and pour water in, there isn't going to be very much space for the water, right? There's not a lot of oxygen or airspace in between those sand particles because they're so small, they clump together. The difference here is that when the bacteria and the fungi make macro aggregates of all the little bits and they wrap them up into a yarn ball, this is like a marble. This is like putting marbles into your vase instead of sand. And so you can imagine that if you've got marbles in your vase, you've got much more porosity, much more airspace. And if you pour water in, that vase is going to hold a lot more water. And so this is why, one of the reasons why microbes are so important to the actual physical structure of soil is they are the ones that are creating the clumps, creating the marbles that hold space in the soil for things like oxygen and water, which everything in the soil desperately depends on. The second example I want to give you is about the influence on the chemical structure or the chemical aspects of soil. And this one I think is just so cool. I love sharing this one. So you probably know that plants depend on a variety of macro and micronutrients. the thing is that every nutrient has a specific pH level that it is most easily absorbed at. And a lot of them are around 7, 6.5 to 7.5. And that's why, you kind of are always aiming to have a neutral, around a neutral pH of your soil. But there's certain micronutrients that are sort of way out of whack. They either require really low pH or really high pH. So one example is boron. Boron requires a pH of about 5.5 for maximum absorbency by that plant, by that root system. So traditionally, gardeners or growers have had to futz around with the pH of their soil to try and find, what is that exact perfect level that's going to maximize the absorption of as many nutrients as possible. And that's really a conventional old school way of thinking about it, because what we know now is that the microbes will actually take care of this challenge if we let them. If we have that diversity, if we have that thriving microbial community, what they're going to be able to do, there'll be certain microbes that will clump around one section of the root system. And those specific microbes will release an enzyme that brings down the pH of the soil just in that little area, just in that specific area around that specific root. And what that's going to allow is that root will then have a very small area where it has the 5.5 pH, that low pH that it requires to absorb the boron with maximum efficacy. And then it'll be able to transport that boron into other parts of the plant. And so hopefully that illustrates for you that by working with microbes, we can actually let them do a lot of the heavy lifting, or a lot of the more challenging aspects that, previously it was thought that as a grower we had to manage these various challenges. Well, it turns out the microbes can take care of it as long as we let them. All right, let's talk a little bit about why soil health is so important. So we ran a trial here. Pretty clearly that the tomatoes on the right did much better. The only difference here was that the pails on the left were purely black earth, and the pails on the right were black earth with 30% soil booster. So something pretty big, pretty impactful is happening in terms of the worm manure, and what is it exactly that's making have this difference? Well, to be able to explain that, we have to quickly talk about the worm. And I know you guys all know what a worm looks like. You're all gardeners and growers, so hopefully you've seen some worms in your soil. But a couple of things I want to point out to you here, and that is that a worm has a crop and a gizzard, and these two pieces are what breaks down the food that the worms eat and opens up the surface area. So it sort of like smushes apart whatever it was the worm ate, whatever waste organic material the worm ate. It opens up the surface area of that material so that when it moves along to the worm's intestines, the hundreds of thousands of microbes that live there can immediately get to work. And what those microbes are doing, some of them are absorbing nutrients for the worm, so the worm can go on and be healthy. But primarily what those microbes are doing in the worm is breaking down those nutrients that are in that organic matter and repurposing them into plant available format. And then the worm will poop out that material where it's covered in this microbial life. So I want you to think of worms. Worms were sort of, you can call them Mother Nature's intestine. They're the garbage eaters of the world, but they really serve this important purpose of taking a waste material and creating it into something that is incredibly valuable. The other thing that I always like to point out about this picture is that you and I have something in our body that looks very similar to this worm. And chances are you probably have already figured it out, and that is that we have an intestine that is very similar in shape and function to the worm. And this is really important. And I always like to mention this next piece because if there's even one person here that doesn't know about this, it's important to talk about it. And that is that up until World War II, humans were doing an okay job of growing our food, of looking after our ecosystems. We weren't doing the best. We weren't doing as well as our First Nations have been doing for many, many years. But, and that's because we started using the plow, and it turns out plowing is actually a bad thing, not a good thing, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the key point here is that it was only after World War II that major chemical companies like Bayer and Monsanto, they went to the US government and they said, hey, listen, you know, the war is over. We just built all these big factories because we were making chemical warfare. We were making chemicals that killed the enemy, things like Agent Orange. And, you know, the war is over now, so we really have to figure out something else to do with these chemicals. Otherwise, you know, your economy is going to go into a tailspin. We employ millions of Americans. Let's figure out something to do. Oh, wait, look, we tried applying these to a big agricultural field and everything is just exploded. Everything's growing really big and it looks really healthy. This must be the solution. This is what we're going to do. We're going to turn agricultural fields into production, processes where we're applying these chemicals, and everything's going to work out just really fabulously. Well, we all know probably by now that things did not actually work out that well. I mean, they worked out well for the chemical companies, right? Because conventional agriculture just took over through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. We did this all over the planet. We put all these chemicals onto our soil and then made farmers dependent on adding more and more and more. Unfortunately, what we didn't know then, which we do know now, is that these chemicals kill the microbes in the soil. And unfortunately, what this means is that it makes the farmer, it makes the plant dependent on further continuous inputs, chemical inputs, because it's lost the biology, it's lost the Mother Nature ecosystem that was previously providing all these nutrients. One analogy I always like to use as to how this all came to pass is that I want you to think about chemical fertilizers like an all-you-can-eat buffet for your plants. If you and I went to an all-you-can-eat buffet every day, we would grow too, but it wouldn't be healthy growth. And this is what we've done to our food. Yes, today you can buy a big, large, ripe, red tomato at the supermarket, but chances are you've heard that tomato has 50% less nutrition, fewer nutrients than a tomato that my grandmother grew 60, 80, 100 years ago. And this is a direct result, this lack of nutrition in our food is a direct result of the lack of microbial life being in the soil, because without the microbes in the soil, your plant is not getting the nutrients that it needs. Now, perhaps more importantly than just blaming the chemical companies, is looking at the damage that this has done to our health. And one of the things that has come to light in the last, let's say 10, 15 years is that we have our own microbiome in our intestine, just like that worm did. And it turns out that the microbes that are in soil are the same microbes that are in worms. Of course, they evolved together, but they're also the same microbes that need to be in us. And this is where we've run into a big problem. And the problem is twofold. The first is that we are eating this food now that is grown with chemicals, and therefore when we eat it, we're not eating any of the microbes that we're supposed to be ingesting. We evolved with soil, with plants, and with microbes, and we evolved to constantly replenish our own microbial system with the microbes that are supposed to be on our food. Unfortunately, food doesn't have microbes on it, at least conventional food you buy at the grocery store. And so our own microbiomes are suffering because they're not getting this fresh influx of microbes. Furthermore, the food from the grocery store is covered in pesticide residue. And this further damages, we eat that, and it kills, just like it killed the microbes in the soil, it kills the microbes in us. And therefore, we are suffering massive ill health, which it's only starting to come to light now that many of society's ill health that has come largely to light in the last 20 or 30 years can be directly related to the damage that we have done to our own microbiome. So this is a really important piece. This is where I always urge you. I know most of you are growing your own food. So the great thing about being a gardener or growing your own food is that it gives you a chance to absorb, to bring in some of these new healthy microbes. So when you're out, digging in the soil, getting it under your fingernails, you get a little up your nose by accident, that's a really good thing. That is going to keep you healthy because you're getting fresh new microbes into your system that your body depends on to be healthy.